All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Anna Heller. I'm the Bruce A. Beal Director of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I am delighted to see so many of you here and so many of you representing the Morse Museum. Thank you for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce the director of the Morse Museum in just a second. But before I do that, I would like to acknowledge the Thomas P. Johnson Scholarship Fund here at Rollins, which sponsors all our lectures, public lectures for the season. And this is our last lecture for this season and the first to talk about the exhibition in our front gallery, The McKean Legacy in Winter Park. Before there was a Morse Museum of American Art, there was a Morse Gallery of Art on the Rollins campus, and that is what the exhibition is dedicated to, and our guest curator is here to speak about the exhibition and her research in just a second. But it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lawrence Ruggiero, the director of the Morse Museum of American Art, who will then introduce our speaker. And I'm very thankful to see him here. I want to acknowledge the collaboration of the Morse Museum in organizing this exhibition and lending us all the treasures, most of the treasures that you see in the gallery up front. And I just want to say that personally, I learned from this exhibition and from our guest curator, Tricia, and from Larry, how important, and I hadn't quite realized this. I've been here a year and a half now, and I hadn't quite realized how extraordinarily important the legacy of Jeannette and Hugh McKean and of the Morse Gallery of Art is to the Cornell. And the way, what we are today as a museum is so deeply indebted to the way that the McKeans had set up the Morse Gallery in the 1940s and going forward. And so looking at our future, I had to learn a lot from our past, and I'm thankful for that. Dr. Ruggiero is, of course, known to all of you as the person who took the Morse Museum to its next level from the move from the little gallery here to the spectacular museum on Park Avenue that you're all familiar with. And he holds a Ph.D. in art history from University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from Boston University, and has come to the Morse after having been the director of the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, and before then he was the executive director of the Oakland Museum Association in California, and started out as an assistant to the president at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So it is my pleasure to welcome him today, and I will pass the podium on to Dr. Ruggiero. Thank you.
Two reasons why I'm particularly pleased, happy, delighted to be here tonight. It was very sweet of Jeannette to invite me to say a word. And the first is that it's just terrific as the officially, I suppose, the museum is one of the key elements in the legacy of the McKeans, but to see that celebrated, that legacy celebrated and marked here at Rollins at the Cornell by our new director of the Cornell is just marvelous, and it makes us all very happy, makes us all feel that we're doing the right thing. And there's a great deal in that, the benefactions of the McKeans to be grateful for, and so it's always useful to remember it, and it's always a great joy to share it with everyone. So I'm very grateful to Anna and her staff and Pat here for doing such a good job on the exhibition. But the other reason why I'm happy is because before Tricia Pongracz became the curator of the Morse Legacy here. She had a dissertation at Brown University in the monastic architecture and female patronage in 13th century France, the Royal Abbey of Saint-Jean-au-Bois, and was a Crest Fellow, as I was, very prestigious, if I do say so myself. So she's prestigious. But how I met her was, well, then she went on, and she, after her graduating, she went to the American Bible Society. She was curator and exhibition coordinator for a few years. Then she was an adjunct professor at the College of St. Elizabeth in Morristown, New Jersey. Then she was an adjunct professor at New York Center for the Arts and Media Studies. Then she became the chief curator at MoBI, the Museum of Biblical Art, and Then after that, she did more at the Museum of Biblical Art, curator at large, director of curatorial affairs, and then acting director. And Anna discovered her, I imagine, it was during that period of the great rise of this institution, which Anna headed, and it's a fine museum, Museum of Biblical Art. But before that, when Pat was, what, 11, and I was fairly new around here, we decided we're going to put the chapel up, the Tiffany Chapel. And I was complaining about how we were going to get enough information to know how to do this correctly. Don't worry, I'm only going to take half an hour. How to do this correctly. And so one board member actually said, well, a friend of mine has a daughter who might be able to help you. We said, oh my God, here we go. 2 or 3 people on the board said, oh, you don't have to do that. You don't have to hire somebody just because they're a friend of the daughter of somebody on the board. So anyway, Pat was this friend, was the daughter of this friend. And he said, you know what, this isn't all bad. She's got a Brown University. She's doing serious work. Let's see. And so we sent her out to get pictures that would help us install Tiffany's Chapel the way it was in 1893 at the Chicago Exposition. So she had to go out to, she ended up being in Chicago, waiting day after day because they would only open the Historical Society archives on Wednesdays at 3:30 in the afternoon. And there were boxes with nothing, no indication of what was in them, so she had to go through all these boxes, but only from 3:30 to 4:30 on Wednesday afternoons, which she did. And she came up with the photograph of the chapel in its 1893 efflorescence in the Manufacturers Building at the Chicago Exposition of 1893. Subsequently, we said, we have a gem. Anna knew that. She hired her. We have a gem, and we wanted to know more about our association windows, the ones that go out at Christmas time. I still have to read the title. These were the Association for the Relief of Respectable Aged Indigent Females in New York. You understand why I have to read it. We didn't know very much about those windows, truth be told, so we put Pat on it, and now we know everything there is to know about those windows. So she's a wonderful researcher, and when I heard that Anna was going to bring her in to help with this exhibition, I was so pleased that someone as competent as she and someone who we knew was going to be involved. Most recently, she is now Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in the Art History in the American Wing, being a Senior Art Historical Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of New York. And so here she is, Pongracz.
Thank you very, very, very much for that very wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight. The foundation story of the Morse Gallery of Art is one of belief in the power and importance of art. It is at once local, centered here in Winter Park, Florida, and national and international, part and parcel of the history of art in Europe and the United States beginning in the 1940s. The gallery opened in February of 1942, just 2 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and Germany and Italy's declaration of war on the US just a few days after that. Though Jeannette genius, she and Hugh would not marry until June of 1945, had been discussing plans for an art building or center on campus with Rollins since 1936, formal planning and construction of the Morse Gallery of Art didn't start until the late fall of 1941. And despite the seismic changes, both at home and abroad, the opening of and support for the gallery proceeded uninterrupted as the United States entered and fought World War II. Genius underwrote the entire cost of the new building. On view here, this is an image from 1943, a sum of $10,500, which is more than $150,000 in today's dollars, as well as all costs related to mounting exhibitions. Together, Genius and McKean oversaw the programming and day-to-day administration of the gallery. He is director, and she is director of exhibitions. They selected, organized, designed, and installed the exhibitions, keeping in mind just how new and innovative this enterprise in Central Florida was. In their words, their pioneering effort had dual goals: to, quote, make art a part of community life and aid international amity through cultural channels. To Genius, McKean, and at the time Rollins College President Hamilton Holt, the three responsible for realizing the building and the programming, art mattered. It had the capacity to foster cultural understanding, could communicate meaning and ideas, and bring beauty into the world at a time when it was sorely lacking. During World War II, the exhibitions Genius and McKean programmed were also a way of demonstrating solidarity. Whether displaying exhibitions from Allied countries or of works of art created by those serving in the armed forces, they consciously scheduled shows that brought attention to the war effort both at home and abroad. And this strategy mirrored the work at other American museums like the Museum of Modern Art and the Brooklyn Museum in New York, two institutions with which the Morse Gallery of Art worked directly, and the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. At this time, every American museum knew full well that culture was under siege, and all of them looked to the National Gallery in London as a model for what could be done. And here I just offer some broad context by way of background. In 1937, Hitler's regime stripped public and private collections of art the Fuhrer deemed degenerate, and that was basically anything he didn't like that didn't conform to his aesthetic of naturalism. And here I show you some images of that exhibition. So it was a systematic plundering of private and public institutional collections in Germany at the time. And it was displayed and it traveled throughout Germany. And the writing, the graphics above it, unlike the graphics that we have today which explain and exemplify, these were derisive comments. And here you've got Hitler visiting with officers. And this is an image of art, Dada art. Works by modern artists like Otto Dix, Kirchner, Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, Franz Marc, Kandinsky, among many others, there were 113 works included in this show, were displayed and basically publicly ridiculed. Upon the close of the exhibition, the works were either sold or destroyed, and institutional collections were further purged of other art deemed degenerate, including works by Edgar Degas, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Cézanne, many of which were sold by the Third Reich at auction and for profit. This violent, public, governmentally orchestrated assault on modern culture and thought, combined with the German army's systematic and well-documented plunder of Europe's art, was a depth of cultural destruction unparalleled in the 20th century. And it's something we're still coming to terms with today. As many of you know, a trove of 1,400 artworks was discovered in Germany in the possession of Cornelius Gurlitt, whose father was a Nazi art dealer, and it was only made public this past November. The Neue Gallery in New York City is actually hosting an exhibition about degenerate art and what its implications were, and it has some of the art that was actually displayed. That's up until June. And this past fall, the Cornell Fine Arts Museum hosted Auction 392, chronicling the dissolution of Gallery Stern in Berlin. And I'm sure many of you have seen Burt Lancaster in the Train from 1964, and of course, most recently, George Clooney's Monuments Men. So it's something that the popular culture has embraced since the 60s, and there's a resurgence of interest in it now. In addition, the Nazis were looting private and institutional collections on the continent, as Monuments Men showed, and collections in England, in particular in London, were threatened by the Blitz. Now, days before the declaration of war on September 3rd, 1939, the National Gallery London emptied its galleries, which was a very, very smart move. Initially, the art was stored across locations in Wales, and then in the summer of 1941, when the gallery realized this was going to be long-term, it went to a slate mine, a disused slate mine in Minode, where it stayed until 1945, until aggression was ended and there was no more bombing. So from October 1940 to April 1941, the National Gallery was actually bombed 9 times, and in some cases sustaining very serious damage. Parts of it needed to be closed. Despite the bombardment, the museum stayed open, hosting visitors for concerts, temporary exhibitions, and beginning in 1942, to one masterwork at a time from the permanent collection, which would be especially brought out from storage at the mine and driven to London and shown and then put in the basement in the air raid shelter every night in a series which is still running today titled Picture of the Month. And the first painting to be brought out of the mine was Titian's Noli Me Tangere. The National Gallery's uninterrupted programming in the midst of dire circumstances drew thousands of visitors, leading one commentator to call the museum, quote, a defiant outpost of culture in the middle of a bombed and shattered metropolis. The museum community in the United States was acutely aware of what was happening to cultural institutions in the European theater. American museum professionals programmed exhibitions, concerts, and film screenings in solidarity. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. opened in March 1941, and at the museum's dedication, President Roosevelt spoke directly to the importance of art and culture, saying, quote, to accept this work today is to assert the purpose of the people in America, that the freedom of human spirit and human mind, which has produced the world's great art, shall not be utterly destroyed. Although the National Gallery of Art did secure several of its masterworks in off-site storage, that museum also stayed open. And in addition to hosting exhibitions from its permanent collection that was still there, it too organized concerts and temporary exhibitions related to the war effort and of works by servicemen and women. The National Gallery of Art also opened a lounge, especially for members of the U.S. Armed Forces. And this was something that was happening in New York too, where Jeannette Genius also had a home. The Brooklyn Museum also programmed exhibitions directly related to the war, and in 1943 alone, they had 13 war-related shows. And just over the East River in Manhattan, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, was doing the same thing. And in addition, they were screening war documentaries, which were made in England by British directors, and those made in the United States by American directors who were in the various theaters or working here at home. MoMA opened a Veterans Arts Center, and it offered free admission for GIs. And throughout the country, museums stayed open, displaying art relevant to contemporary events. And the Morse Gallery of Art here on Rollins campus made itself part of this national movement. Now, MoMA also circulated traveling shows, and several of those came throughout the time here at Rollins to the Morse Gallery of Art. But the foreword to their catalog advertising exhibitions for 1942 and 43 opened with a series of questions. What good is art in a time of war? What good are art museums during a national crisis? Why maintain our cultural interests and activities when the air hums with news of battle? And it answered. These are questions which confronted every museum even before the United States entered the war. Captain S.F. Markham, MP of the British Expeditionary Force, who was also the president of the Museums Association in London, said this in 1940, quote, for some of us, there is pride and honor of helping to push back a ruthless barbarism that is the enemy of everything we hold dear. But we shall fight in vain if behind us there is not kept burning with a sturdy light a flame of learning and culture. The great task of museums and art galleries in this country during the war is to help preserve the basic sanity of our peoples, and anything that can be done in this respect will be of greater ultimate value than most of us can perhaps realize. Now, with this in mind, with all of this circulating and this current in mind, Genius and McKean opened the Morse Gallery of Art and supported it unwaveringly. And from 1942 to 1945, at the height of U.S. involvement in World War II, amid rationing, transportation and communication disruptions, blackout drills, among other logistical issues, shipping problems, insurance problems, they brought international exhibitions from allied countries to campus annually. They were doing international shows annually. And they did this at the highest professional level. Printed materials were elegantly designed and on par with those created for major metropolitan museums. Press releases were circulated, and for many of the exhibitions, though not all, but many, professional installation photographs were commissioned, and I'm going to show you some of those tonight. The exhibitions selected to foster goodwill with the United States allied countries included the Arts of Costa Rica, in February of 1942, that was the inaugural show. Pre-Columbian Colonial and Folk Art of Latin America and Contemporary Latin American Paintings in March of that same year, The Arts and Crafts of French Canada in 1943, The Netherlands and Netherlands Indies at Peace and at War in 1944, a version of which was also shown at the Brooklyn Museum just the year earlier. Genius bore all costs for shipping, insuring, and installing these exhibitions. Now, the timing of the development, programming, and uninterrupted support of the Morse Gallery of Art was a statement affirming the importance of art and culture in a contemporary society. In preparation for the first exhibition, and this is a pamphlet which is on display in the gallery if you want to go see it after we're done here, in January of 1942. So we're in January. The building is still being built. This building is not done. It's still being built. But Hugh McKean wrote to Mrs. Doris Stone, who was an American scholar specializing in Latin American archaeology, and she happened to live in San Jose, Costa Rica, to request her assistance in planning an exhibition which was to open in February. He cited a twofold reason for wanting to have this exhibition here now in February of 1942. Quote, he wrote to her, "The first is that North Americans can learn much from the older cultures of Central and South America. The second is that we would like to do our part in honoring Costa Rica because of its immediate and valued support in our war with the forces of evil." Costa Rica was the first Latin American republic to enter the war after the United States did, and they entered in allegiance with the United States. In her positive response, Stone cabled to McKean, "Can arrange fine exhibition, but not until the 15th. So now we're at January 15th. It opens in a month. Government delighted and will stand expense to boat from here, nearest port, New Orleans." And this is what opened on February 17th. For visitors to the gallery, McKean made clear the importance of this effort, and he wrote in the introduction, "We shall bring here the things people make for the joy of making, whether they be painted bowls or ox carts, carvings or pictures. We shall encourage more the desire to understand than to judge. If we succeed in helping others to find the meaning and the beautiful in art from all times and places, the good accomplished here will last longer than these walls." This show was a huge hit, and it was nationally recognized. There are cables of, "I'm sorry I cannot come, but good luck and what you're doing is important," from Nelson Rockefeller, from Thomas J. Watson, who was the president of IBM, and other from the state senators for Florida. People knew that this was going on, and they thought it was really important. During the war years, the Morse Gallery of Art also brought attention to the men and women in the United States Armed Forces, which included Hugh McKean. He served in the U.S. Navy from 1942 to 1945 as a lieutenant commander and instructor at the Advanced Naval Intelligence School, and his service actually took him to India for 1 year, where he served under Commodore Gene Markey. Now, like the Brooklyn Museum, the Morse Gallery of Art regularly featured art created by servicemen, including titles like Soldiers of Production, watercolors by men in service at AAF-TAC, which stands for the American Air Forces Tactical Center, which was here in Orlando. It was not too far away. Painting by men in service, and the Army at War Italian campaign, which concluded that series in 1945. Now, while all of this was going on, you had the one trend of supporting and promoting the war effort and making sure that people understood what was going on and how it impacted art and why art was important. From her home in New York City, Genius cultivated relationships with museums as she contracted to borrow traveling exhibitions to display here. Her support of the arts during wartime did not go unnoticed by those in the museum community. And when she contracted in 1942 with MoMA to borrow the Introduction to Modern Painting from the Museum of Modern Art, the director of the circulating exhibitions at the time wrote back to Genius saying, quote, "Your generous gift to Rollins College comes at a time when it will be doubly appreciated, I am sure, since many people are unwilling to devote time and money to activities not pertaining directly to the war effort, and consequently, the cultural work of our free-thinking country is being seriously challenged. So this was an affirmation of this is a good thing to do and an important thing to do, especially at a time like this. So the work of the Morse Gallery of Art was becoming known beyond its Central Florida walls. Now, in addition to the exhibitions related to the war effort, McKean and Genius also regularly programmed displays of modern art, and I think that that was deliberate. It was deliberate in the face of the cultural assault that the whole world was feeling, and so they took this art that was very difficult to understand, that many people just sort of looked at and didn't understand or didn't want to understand, and year after year, for the fall and the spring seasons, they programmed this art. So in the spring of 1943, the gallery showed 2 exhibitions focused on contemporary art. One was called European and American Paintings in the 20th Century, which featured works by Arthur B. Davies and Edward Hopper, among other people, and then the next exhibition was a central focus on how to read a work of modern art, and it was called The Plan of a Painting, and it was exclusively focused on Edward Hopper's Manhattan Bridge Loop. Then in 1944, they hosted an exhibition entitled 20th Century Portraits, which included works by Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, Giorgio de Chirico, and Pablo Picasso, and these were some of the very same artists whose work had been condemned and shown in the Degenerate Art exhibition. So bringing exhibitions focused on 20th century artistic trends challenged visitors to the Morse Gallery of Art, as they did everywhere else at the time. And in a strikingly honest comment, President Holt wrote to Genius in response to an exhibition entitled Arts and Therapy, which was on loan from MoMA in 1945, saying, "I am greatly pleased with the exhibit now on, even if I don't understand all the surrealism and cubism which are exemplified in some of the pictures." So they pushed, and people responded. And most importantly, they created an environment in which it was okay not to understand, because that's fine. You come here to appreciate and to learn and to expand, and that's what they did year after year after year. Now, after the war, their focus shifted a little bit, and it shifted in part to design and decorative arts, and these were areas of interest to both Jeannette and Hugh. In addition to the regularly programmed work of Rollins students, whom they always ardently supported, traveling exhibitions borrowed from major museums, and the work of Florida artists, the McKeans began to program original exhibitions through which they developed and refined their curatorial interests and their voices. In 1948, Jeannette Genius McKean, she and Hugh had married in June of '45, organized Contemporary Design in Many Mediums, a lone exhibition of contemporary interior design. And here's what it looked like. It had 176 objects, borrowed from George Jensen's Steuben Glass, the Scalamandra Museum of Textiles. You can see all the beautiful fabrics that just line the gallery. The Whitcomb Furniture Company of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and here in Winter Park, the Whistling Oyster and the Music Box, which lent a Magnavox television, because that was new in 1948. That was very new. And this exhibition marked Mrs. McKean's curatorial debut. And here you see Hugh McKean in a posed picture looking at all these wonderful objects. So you can see the pelican. I think that might be a flamingo. I think that's a squirrel. I'm not sure, but you can see this beautiful etched glass with all of this silver, and how strikingly modern some of it is here and here. So of this, Mrs. McKean wrote, "This is an exhibition of furnishings for our homes, designed by some of the great artists of our time. Current explorations into unknown art fields and new uses of ancient traditions are to be found here. I believe innovations in the use of line, color, and form are often easier to understand in articles made for our homes than in other forms of art." So they had all of this richness, these fine fabrics, the furniture, lamps, vases, coffee services, everything. And they set them up in vignettes, not only on display here, but you'll notice the fabric is made to look like draperies, and it's set in vignettes. And as you know, if you've ever tried to sell a house, it always sells better if it's staged. Well, if you're trying to understand objects, they always make more sense in a context. So they were showing all these wonderful home designs in a context of use. And this was something that was done by many major museums throughout the 1950s and 60s, including MoMA and the Brooklyn. In 1950, the McKeans organized an even more ambitious and startling modern interior design exhibition. New design filled the gallery with more than a dozen interior vignettes incorporating wallpaper, furniture, floor coverings, and lighting. And the result was a stunning array of contemporary interior design. So you can see, here's a wall covering by Matisse. You've got things by chairs by Eames, the molded plywood chairs here and here. You have this wonderful mural by Calder, flanked by the Eames chairs. You have this gooseneck double table lamp and this natural birch chair, both lent from George Jensen. And to bring home that this is a domestic setting, there's their Cocker Spaniel, who came in, who was not here all the time, but was brought in when these professional shots were done. And remember, we're so used to standing here now, taking pictures with our cell phones, and the ubiquity of photography is, I mean, it's just part of our daily lives. It wasn't at this point in time. Film was expensive, you had professionals doing this, not everybody had a camera, so these are really beautiful, professionally done photographs that were meant to document and preserve a history. And most of the photographs, not all, but most of the photographs that I'm showing, well, all of the photographs that I'm showing you here, and most of the photographs that are on display in the gallery are actually from the Rollins archives here. So the McKeans really took time, and the college has really taken care to make sure that this visual legacy has been preserved. Now, realizing that perhaps Winter Park hadn't seen anything quite like new design, in the foreword to the pamphlet for the show, Hugh McKean struck a gentle but firm tone. New design brings to the Morse Gallery of Art new uses of line, shape, and color in an old field, decoration for the home. Mrs. McKean and I have gone to no small amount of trouble to assemble these exhibits, and we put them all up ourselves. They were very hands-on. You may find them surprising and delightful. If so, or if they help you see in a new way, that will give us great pleasure and help us forget our sore thumbs. If you do not like this show, remember, the fault may lie with you. Which I think is great. So, in 1955, the Morse Gallery of Art organized another show, works of art by Louis Comfort Tiffany, and this is an invitation for that show, which helped reintroduce Louis Comfort Tiffany, who died in 1933, to the history of American decorative arts. This exhibition earned national attention, including a review in the New York Times. Now today, we recognize Tiffany and Tiffany Studios' work to be some of the finest in the history of decorative arts. You're like, well, of course they had Tiffany. This was not the case in 1955. And the recognition that this studio and Tiffany as a designer, Louis Comfort, has, the recognition that he has today is due in large part to the steady work of Jeannette and Hugh McKean that began in the late 40s and then really blossomed in the 50s and the 60s and has continued to on Park Avenue here through the present day. What they did in this show, and I'm sorry I don't have any images to show you, but you can just visualize, it was lots of cases and it was lots of large and small works of art, some of which we have here borrowed from the Morse Museum of Art, the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of Art. They had 200 objects from the collections of the Met, the Smithsonian, as well as their own private collection. And the number and variety of objects ranged from vases to finger bowls, jewelry, and a table lamp, and it was designed to suggest the breadth and the depth of the firm's production. So they really wanted to show through this carefully curated, diverse group of objects why Tiffany was important and how Tiffany participated in the history of American decorative arts. Works of Art by Louis Comfort Tiffany was the first exhibition at the Morse Gallery of Art to have a more substantive written work. Previous to this, there had been an invitation, and in some cases, just a trifold pamphlet or, a pamphlet that opened like this. This had an actual booklet. It had something much like what was on your seat when you walked in. It was a 14-page booklet with an introduction by now President McKean. He was elected Rollins College president in 1951. And most importantly, it had a full checklist listing each object, its accession number, so the number that the museums would have given it, and the Tiffany Studio signature if the object were marked. So doing this, the gallery published an early guide, an early professional guide to Tiffany Studio's production. And in this booklet, which is on view in the gallery, Mr. McKean wrote, "To any who might think of Mr. Tiffany as a dated artist and of importance only in the Art Nouveau movement flourishing at the turn of the century, may I express a word of caution. Here in this room, the creative spirit can be seen in all its power. Here are free forms, sometimes thought of as originating in the school of Paris. The clean line of modern art is here too. There are fresh shapes and colors and textures here, the creation of Mr. Tiffany. In this art, there is the daring and adventure of creation. These qualities keep art always new and always modern." So he's creating a narrative that puts Tiffany in the context of 20th century modern art. To those with very conservative inclinations, he continues, a word of caution. Many of these objects represent nothing at all. They are three-dimensional abstract shapes meant to be seen and enjoyed as such. Their sole purpose is to delight the eye with line, shape, color, and texture, and to vitalize the mind with the creative force of good art. That same could be said for many of the mobiles and abstract sculptures and pictures being made today. Now, this exhibition became an example of what a critic writing for the New York Times described as, quote, "the phenomenon of conscientious revivals." And in her review, which she entitled Famous, Derided, and Revived, she noted that the works of art in this show was one of the most recent events in the, quote-unquote, resurrection of Tiffany's legacy. And when she was discussing the history of this revival, she concluded by way of a warning, but with a nod to what had been done here in Florida with those 200 objects, and this is what she wrote. "The Tiffany revival is well on its way, promoted, if you will, by museums, art historians, and magazines. We are a country where fashions rage like prairie fires. The warning would be to move slowly, to distinguish and discriminate, lest the case be once more oversold. Such exhibitions as the Rollins College one offer a good opportunity for discernment and differentiation." And I think what she was saying was that it was curated well. It had the breadth, but it also had the depth, and it was well selected and well chosen. Now, this exhibition was also personally important to President McKean, and as many of you are aware, he actually had met Tiffany as an art student in residence at Tiffany's famed Laurelton Hall estate in the 1930s, and he admired Mr. Tiffany. From this point forward, so from 1955 forward, the McKeans would regularly program work by Tiffany into the Morse Gallery of Art's schedule, including an exhibition from their collection in 1959, an exhibit of Tiffany windows in 1963, and then all of this culminated in the reinstallation in 1967 of a gallery dedicated to the work of Louis C. Tiffany, which was opened on his 119th birthday. And we'll look at some pictures. I do have some installation pictures of that in just a minute. Throughout the 1950s, the Morse Gallery of Art continued to introduce the campus and community to the many artistic innovations happening over the course of the 20th century. They were looking at modern art. They were looking at art that had been in the 1913 Armory Show. As always, the dynamic programming encouraged visitors to consider new ideas. In the spring of 1958, the gallery brought exhibition of paintings from the Whitney Museum of Art, which was a traveling exhibition and it included paintings from various contemporary artists. And then in 1960, they really started to hit their stride. It was a very rich year for showing contemporary painting on campus. So in just 5 years, well, actually, at this point, we're in 1960. Over the 15 years, they were very conscious of making sure they were in step with what was going on in terms of current events, of making the case for why art was significant and important at all times, and really starting to promote and embrace and educate about the history of modern art. In February of 1960, the gallery displayed an original loan exhibition titled Painters Who Search for New Art Forms. Organized by Hugh McKean with what he described as the, quote, aid and comfort, end quote, because he knew it was hard for him too, of Robert Beverly Hale, curator of American painting and sculpture at the Met, this show featured 18 works of art borrowed from several prominent New York City galleries. And this is very exciting because we just found these photographs that I'm going to show you this morning, and with the very generous help of Darla Moore, who is in the audience tonight, she scanned them for me so we could see them. This exhibition was scheduled to coincide with a conference, quote, during which scholars and artists will discuss art and science as a language for tomorrow. The works on view certainly were a rich topic for discussion. So this is one end of the gallery. And what I love about this is here you've got Ellsworth Kelly. This is probably by Agnes Martin. And over here, can you just see what's in the case? It's Tiffany. And this is the other side of the gallery. So here you have a work by Rauschenberg. I think that might also be a work by Rauschenberg. So this is in the gallery in 1960. This is known as a combine, and this is what Mr. McKean wrote in his introduction. Those visitors who enjoy the adventure of a search for new art forms will like many of these vivid and decorative organizations of shapes and colors. Some visitors to the exhibition may find it puzzling and intriguing. And here you have a photograph of visitors looking at Robert Rauschenberg's combine. For this group, some, and especially those who believe there is an indissoluble connection between painting and simulating the appearance of the world as we see it, you may not care too much for this exhibition. And for that group, for the group who preferred naturalism and who preferred traditional painting based on Renaissance form and style, he very gently suggested that they walk on over to Alumni House and see the old master paintings in Rollins' collection, thereby saying there's something for everyone here. The Morse Gallery of Art ended its schedule in 1960 with the exhibition The Eight and the American Scene. It featured the work of artists instrumental in bringing the 1913 Armory Show to New York City, thus introducing the United States to European modern art. And throughout the 1960s, the Morse Gallery of Art continued its commitment to international amity, scheduling several exhibitions still on international art, and two of them were very notable. One was dedicated to the art of Thailand, and the other to the pre-Columbian arts of Mexico. And this is the arts of Siam, and it was on view in February of 1963. It brought 24 objects related to the culture and the religion of Thailand to campus, and around it were scheduled talks and dance and music and lectures on religion and history related to the history of Thailand. and set in an atmospherically lit gallery with this wonderful reflecting pool at the center, which really must have wreaked havoc on the humidity and temperature levels, which is enough to make you weep as a curator. The exhibition was a really well-attended hit. It was a very well-attended hit. There were dignitaries who came from Washington. The ambassador from Thailand at the time made a point to come. And then the art of pre-Columbian Mexico was on display during Founders Week of 1964, the following year. And I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of that, but we do have these wonderful pamphlets. So here, it's a 3-color pamphlet. We're starting to get pamphlets now that have images on them. Up until this point, there haven't been so much. This had 53 objects. And the other thing is, you know, when you look at the sheer number of works of art that were being brought to campus annually, it's amazing. The inaugural exhibition, the one about Costa Rica, had 70 objects. Then there were some that had 200, like the Tiffany show and other. I mean, they just were bringing an enormous amount of beautiful objects to campus, and they were doing it for, you know, for 2 academic semesters, for 3 exhibitions each semester. That's a really ambitious program to get things in and out, you know, 6 times a year. So 12 up and downs, it's a lot, and to write for it too. In 1966, the Morse Gallery of Art closed for a little while and it was remodeled. The newly refurbished gallery opened in March of 1967 with 4 galleries, the largest one housing a permanent display of work by Tiffany Studios. And here I'm just showing you some installation shots. In celebration of Louis C. Tiffany's 119th birthday, the McKeans installed 13 windows produced by Tiffany Studios, and you may recognize these as your friends from up on Park Avenue. The dining room set from Tiffany's Laurelton Hall estate, which I do not have a picture of, but I have these installation shots. A selection of glass, pottery, silver, and some of Tiffany's paintings, all on loan from the McKean's private collection. And this exhibition was on view for the next decade, and it was reviewed again in the New York Times, in the Sunday Times, in February of that year. And the preservation of Tiffany's work became the centerpiece of the cultural legacy established by the McKeans, which of course is now on view at the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art. The other 3 galleries in the museum at that time were dedicated. They were dedicated galleries. So you had a Tiffany gallery, then you had another gallery that was dedicated to the permanent collection, and it's very apt that we're sitting in here because these are selections from the permanent collection that were just put up. And then a gallery for temporary exhibitions so that there was always something new to see. And then, of course, there was a long, narrow gallery that was dedicated to the work of Rollins students because the McKeans knew that the point of having a wonderful museum or a gallery on campus is first and foremost for the students who come here. So you had a gallery that transformed from a 1-room gallery that was putting up 6 up and downs a year, 6 shows a year, to one that now had 4 galleries and could program permanently but bring in fresh things as well. In 1968, the Morse Gallery of Art celebrated its 25th anniversary in honor of its founder and benefactor, Jeannette "Genius" McKean. And the college mounted an exhibition of her work because she too was an artist, and one of her paintings is on display in the front gallery here. The exhibition was titled Summertime Remembered, Recent Pastels by Jeannette "Genius." And reflecting on the gallery's impact, the chairman of the board of trustees at Rollins at the time, Mr. Miller Walton, wrote, "The influence of the Morse Gallery of Art has been extensive. More than 200,000 visitors, including college, high school, and grade school students, winter visitors, and residents of Central Florida have taken advantage of the opportunity it has offered them to increase their knowledge of the arts." So more than 200,000 people of all ages, and the McKeans always had a special place in their heart for the education of students, be they very, very small, to college-age kids. They really believed that it was the next generation that was going to continue this. The gallery continued to introduce its visitors to a variety of art through 1976 when it closed its campus location, subsequently to reopen as the larger Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art in Winter Park, and in 1994 in its current location on Park Avenue. The campus building became the core of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, whose central gallery is to this day the McKean Gallery. And that's, if you look through that doorway, that's the light blue gallery. That's the McKean Gallery, where you can see the McKean legacy at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum. The McKean legacy is all around us. The Cornell Fine Arts Museum, the Morse Museum, historic preservation efforts in and around Winter Park, in the memories of the people here tonight who knew Jeannette and Hugh McKean, and in those of us, myself included, who never met them, but have come to know them through their work, or a part of them through their work, a glimpse of which I hope I've given you here tonight, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.